January 1945. A frozen German countryside lies silent beneath drifting smoke. Inside their Panthers, German crews wait, confident that no enemy vehicle on tracks can outrun them. Then, across the white field, something streaks past their sights, too fast, too sudden, too unreal. Before a single turret can fully turn, American Hellcats are already attacking from behind. Doctrine collapses in seconds. Stay with this story, because what happened next changed the rules of armored warfare forever. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its final, brutal phase. The Allied armies that had stormed ashore in Normandy barely 6 months earlier now stood at the very edge of Germany itself. France was largely liberated. Belgium had fallen back into Allied hands after savage fighting. The Rhine River loomed ahead like the last great natural barrier before the heart of the Third Reich. On maps in German headquarters, the front lines were no longer bold arrows cutting forward. They were thin, trembling lines bending backward, day by day. Germany's once feared armored force, the Panzerwaffe, was bleeding. Not from a lack of courage. Not from a lack of experience. But from a war it could no longer sustain. Allied bombers roared over German cities day and night, smashing factories, rail hubs, and fuel depots. By late 1944, German tank formations were often fully equipped on paper yet nearly immobilized in reality. Fuel, not steel, had become the rarest commodity on the battlefield. Panthers and Tigers, the armored monsters of earlier years, now sat hidden in forests and barns, waiting not for the enemy, but for gasoline. Across the lines, the United States fought a very different kind of war. American industry, untouched by bombing and driven by mass production, poured out machines at a pace the world had never seen. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, all arrived at the front in overwhelming volume. Where German units rationed fuel by the liter, American convoys rolled forward in endless columns, engines burning day and night. Logistics became a weapon as powerful as any gun. And in this logistical war, the United States held an unbeatable advantage. The philosophies of armored combat between the two sides had diverged sharply as the war evolved. Germany had built its late-war doctrine around the idea of heavy, dominant battlefield machines, highly armored tanks with powerful guns designed to destroy any opponent at long range. The Panther and Tiger embodied this belief. Thick frontal armor. Devastating firepower. A doctrine that assumed the ability to choose the battlefield, to anchor defenses, and to counterattack with crushing force. The Americans had chosen another path entirely. From the earliest days of the war, U.S. planners believed that tanks should exploit breakthroughs, not duel enemy armor head-on. The task of killing tanks would fall to a separate force, tank destroyers. These fast-moving hunters would rush to threatened sectors, strike German armor from the flanks, and disappear before the enemy could respond. It was a doctrine built on mobility, coordination, and overwhelming fire at the moment of contact, not armor thickness. By late 1944, this difference in philosophy was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding across real battlefields. The German army was now fighting defensively almost everywhere. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble to split the Allied lines in December 1944, Germany had spent its remaining armored reserves in a desperate attempt to regain the initiative. Panthers and Tigers had burned precious fuel pushing through snow-choked forests, only to be met by Allied resistance that refused to break. By January 1945, those same German units were retreating again, their vehicles worn, their crews exhausted, their supply lines collapsing behind them. Winter tightened its grip on the front. Roads turned into rivers of ice and mud. Visibility shrank beneath low clouds and drifting snow. For many armies, movement became slow, cautious, and dangerous. But for the Americans, winter was not only an obstacle, it was an opportunity. U.S. doctrine emphasized flexibility and speed, even in the worst conditions. If something could move, it would move. If a weakness appeared, it would be exploited immediately. German commanders still assumed one constant, that when American armor appeared, it would behave like armor, heavy, deliberate, methodical. They expected Shermans to advance steadily. They expected tank destroyers to set up defensive lines and wait. They did not expect a new kind of threat, one that treated speed itself as a weapon. Behind the German lines, intelligence reports began to circulate with unsettling descriptions. American vehicles that were not quite tanks. Machines that moved faster than anything on tracks had a right to move. Vehicles that struck suddenly at the flanks, fired, and vanished before counterfire could be organized. At first, these reports were dismissed as battlefield confusion. Crews under fire often exaggerated. Speed was notoriously hard to judge in combat. But the reports did not stop. They multiplied. By early January 1945, in scattered engagements along the German frontier, armored commanders began to hear the same unnerving word repeated through radio static and panicked after-action reports: Hellcat. At this stage of the war, every new weapon carried psychological weight far beyond its physical size. German tank crews, veterans of years of brutal fighting, had learned to read the battlefield through sound and vibration. The specific engine note of a Sherman. The heavy growl of a Panther. The deep thunder of a Tiger's Maybach engine. Now, a new sound was entering that grim orchestra, higher pitched, faster, arriving and leaving too quickly for normal response. It was the sound of speed invading a battlefield that had long been ruled by armor. And as winter battles spread across the broken countryside of Western Germany, speed was about to be tested not as an advantage, but as a shock weapon capable of stunning even the most experienced tank crews in Europe. That shock would not come from brute force. It would come from a machine designed to outrun everything the Germans believed controlled the ground. And at its heart lay a radical idea taking physical form: the American M18 Hellcat. The story of how that machine was born begins far from the frozen fields of 1945, inside American factories and design boards where speed was chosen over steel. Long before the M18 Hellcat ever raced across frozen German fields, it existed only as a theory inside American military doctrine, a belief born from hard lessons in 1940 and 1941. The rapid collapse of France had shown the world what fast-moving armored warfare could accomplish. But for the United States, it also revealed a terrifying vulnerability: traditional tanks, advancing in predictable formations, could be shattered by concentrated enemy armor. American planners concluded that tanks alone could not solve the problem of enemy breakthroughs. They needed hunters, mobile, aggressive, and fast. Thus emerged the U.S. tank destroyer doctrine. Tank destroyers were never meant to fight like tanks. They were not to grind forward in steady lines. They were conceived as a rapid response force, held in reserve and unleashed wherever German armor threatened to break through. Their task was simple and ruthless: move fast, strike hard at the flanks, and disappear before the enemy could regroup. Survival would come not from heavy armor, but from never being where the enemy expected. Early American tank destroyers tried to balance firepower and protection, but reality punished compromise. Vehicles like the M10 and M36 were effective, but still too slow to fully embody the doctrine's original vision. What the doctrine demanded was not another armored vehicle, it demanded speed on an entirely new level. By 1942, American engineers were given an uncompromising order: build the fastest tracked fighting vehicle possible, mount it with a powerful gun, and accept every risk that speed required. The result was the M18 Hellcat. From the moment the first prototype rolled out, it stunned everyone who saw it. It did not look like a traditional armored vehicle at all. Its armor was thin, dangerously thin by late war standards. In some areas, it was barely thicker than half an inch. Its turret was open at the top, exposing the crew to weather, shrapnel, and enemy fire from above. To any tanker raised on the doctrine of heavy steel protection, the Hellcat looked unfinished. Vulnerable. Almost reckless. But beneath that thin armor lived the true purpose of the machine. At its heart was a powerful Continental R975 radial engine producing 400 horsepower. In a vehicle weighing barely over 20 tons, this gave the M18 a staggering power-to-weight ratio. On roads, it could reach speeds of over 55 miles per hour, faster than many wheeled vehicles, and absolutely unheard of for tracked armor. Even across rough terrain, it outpaced every tank on the battlefield, German or Allied. Its main gun, a 76mm M1A1 cannon, was not the largest weapon in Europe, but it was more than sufficient when used correctly. Fired from the flanks or rear of German tanks, it could penetrate Panthers and Tigers at practical battlefield ranges. Speed would bring the Hellcat into those lethal angles. The gun would finish what speed began. The crew of 5 lived in a machine built for movement above all else. The driver and assistant driver sat low in the hull, feeling every vibration of the engine and every impact of the terrain. Above them, the gunner, loader, and commander worked in the open turret, exposed to wind, cold, and enemy fragments. There was no illusion of safety. Hellcat crews were trained from the beginning to understand that their protection was motion. Stopping meant dying. Training reflected this brutal reality. Tank destroyer units drilled relentlessly on rapid deployment, high-speed movement, and sudden flanking attacks. Crews practiced firing on the move. They rehearsed immediate withdrawal after engagement. Every maneuver emphasized timing, coordination, and aggression. The Hellcat was not meant to trade blows. It was meant to strike first and vanish. By mid-1944, as American factories accelerated to full wartime output, hundreds of M18s rolled off assembly lines. They were rushed to Europe as Allied planners prepared for the breakout from Normandy and the push toward Germany. Fresh tank destroyer battalions trained on English airfields and muddy countryside, learning how to control a vehicle that behaved like nothing they had ever driven. Some veterans doubted the design. Thin armor and an open turret felt like a return to cavalry thinking in a world now ruled by high-explosive shells. But doctrine was firm. Speed was not a flaw. Speed was the weapon. By the time winter descended on Western Europe in late 1944, the M18 Hellcat was no longer an experiment. It was a deployed reality. Battalions equipped with the fast, lightly armored destroyer were scattered across the front, attached to infantry divisions, armored units, and corps reserves. They waited for the moment when German armor would once again attempt to impose its will on the battlefield. That moment came not in perfect conditions of open combat, but in the confusion of collapsing defenses, frozen ground, and desperate German counterattacks. And when German Panthers finally met Hellcats face to face, neither side would fight according to the old rules anymore. Because once the first high-speed encounters began, the reality of speed colliding with steel would be revealed through the eyes of the men trapped inside both machines. For the men inside the M18 Hellcat, war did not unfold at the slow, grinding pace known to tank crews. It arrived in violent bursts of motion and noise, measured not in minutes but in seconds. The open turret meant the wind cut directly across their faces. Winter air burned their lungs. Snow collected on shoulders and helmets. There was no insulation from the battlefield, only proximity to it. Every explosion felt closer. Every tracer round looked personal. The driver felt the fight first through the engine. When a contact was reported, the Hellcat leapt forward with a surge that pushed bodies back into their seats. Tracks tore at frozen ground. The world blurred at the edges. The commander stood exposed above the turret rim, binoculars pressed to his eyes, calling out targets as the machine hurtled forward. There was no time for hesitation. Their protection was speed, and speed demanded constant commitment. Gunners learned to fire while the vehicle still shook from acceleration. The first round mattered most. A Hellcat that missed its opening shot had already stayed too long. The loader worked in freezing air, arms numbing as shells were rammed home. These men did not think in terms of prolonged duels. They thought in flashes: appear, strike, disappear. Survival depended on never becoming predictable. Inside a German Panther, the war felt entirely different. The Panther was a steel fortress. Sloped frontal armor. A long-barreled 75mm gun capable of killing at extreme range. German crews were trained to fight deliberately. Identify at distance. Halt. Aim. Destroy. The Panther was built for dominance through control of space. But by late 1944, that control was slipping. German tankers were exhausted. Many had survived years of fighting across Russia, France, and now the German frontier. Replacement crews were younger and less experienced. Fuel shortages meant fewer training hours and fewer opportunities to maneuver freely. Panthers often took up static defensive positions, waiting in ambush rather than hunting in the open. Then the Hellcats appeared. To German eyes, they violated every expectation of armored warfare. They did not crawl forward under covering fire. They did not anchor themselves at long range. They moved too quickly across the sights. A Panther's powerful gun was useless if it could not bring its target into alignment in time. Turrets that turned with precision in measured engagements now struggled to track something that crossed open ground in a blur. The psychological effect was immediate. German crews began reporting sightings of fast American destroyers that vanished before return fire could be organized. The battlefield, once governed by careful positioning, was becoming unpredictable. On paper, the Panther outclassed the Hellcat. Its armor could shrug off frontal hits from many Allied guns. Its 75mm KWK-42 cannon could destroy almost any American vehicle at long range. In a static duel, the Hellcat should not have survived. But the battlefield was no longer static. The Hellcat's thin armor allowed it to accelerate faster and maneuver in spaces where heavier tanks hesitated. It could circle wide flanks. It could dash across open terrain before German gunners completed their firing solutions. The Hellcat did not seek frontal engagements. It hunted angles, sides and rears where German armor was weakest. At those points, its 76mm gun did not need brute power. It needed only opportunity. This mechanical contrast created an entirely new rhythm of combat. German tanks fought in measured steps. Hellcats fought in bursts. Panthers anchored and aimed. Hellcats sprinted and stabbed. One was a fortress. The other was a blade. And when these two met, their strengths collided with devastating clarity. For American commanders, the Hellcat offered something battlefield leaders had rarely possessed before: the ability to reposition armored firepower almost as rapidly as infantry could move. If German armor threatened a sector, Hellcats could be shifted there in minutes rather than hours. This compressed decision-making cycles. Opportunities appeared and vanished faster than conventional units could exploit. Tank destroyer battalion commanders learned to think like hunters. They arranged ambush corridors along road networks. They positioned units behind ridgelines and reverse slopes. And they trained their crews to disengage immediately after contact. Even successful kills were treated as temporary victories. The true objective was to stay alive to strike again. On the German side, command decisions became heavier with risk. Defensive lines assumed stable kill zones and predictable advances. The Hellcat shattered these assumptions. When a fast-moving threat could appear on a flank without warning, defensive geometry collapsed. German commanders hesitated to commit Panthers aggressively, unsure from which direction the next strike would arrive. Orders became cautious. Movement became slower. And hesitation on a fluid battlefield was itself a form of defeat. These four perspectives converged wherever Hellcats and Panthers met. Inside the American destroyer, speed was survival. Inside the German tank, stability was safety. Mechanically, one machine relied on motion, the other on mass. Doctrinally, one sought sudden violence, the other deliberate control. And in the frozen months of early 1945, these opposing philosophies would collide not once, but repeatedly across fractured terrain where every engagement punished hesitation and rewarded initiative. Each side believed it understood armored warfare. Only one was about to learn that the rules had shifted faster than a Panther turret could turn. The learning would begin in scattered clashes, brief, violent encounters where German crews first realized that something faster than their fastest tanks was now hunting them across the front. The first true clashes between Hellcats and German Panthers did not arrive with grand announcements or coordinated offensives. They emerged in fragments, brief, violent encounters along hedgerows, forest roads, and frozen farm lanes where neither side expected to meet the other at speed. These were not the kind of tank battles drawn on map tables. They were sudden collisions of doctrine in motion. In late December 1944 and early January 1945, as the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes began to falter and the front lines twisted into chaos, American tank destroyer battalions were rushed forward to seal gaps, protect road junctions, and blunt armored thrusts that still threatened to punch through thinning Allied defenses. Hellcats moved with infantry columns, raced ahead of supply convoys, and took up positions that heavy armor could not reach in time. German Panther units, low on fuel and operating under fractured command, relied heavily on ambush tactics. They positioned themselves along wooded ridgelines and narrow road corridors, waiting for American armor to advance in predictable patterns. For years, this method had worked. But the Hellcats did not advance as expected. In one early engagement near a small Belgian village on the edge of the Ardennes, a German Panther platoon lay hidden along a tree line overlooking a snow-covered road. Their engines idled low. Their guns covered the narrow approach. The crews expected the steady profiles of Sherman tanks to emerge through the white haze. Instead, what appeared first was a blur of movement from the far flank, a Hellcat racing across open ground at a speed the Germans initially misjudged as a scouting vehicle out of position. By the time the Panther commander realized it was an armed tank destroyer, it was already cutting behind his formation. The Hellcat's first shot struck the rear of the lead Panther. The round punched through thin back armor and ignited fuel vapors inside the engine compartment. Smoke burst from the hatches. The second Panther tried to pivot its turret, but the Hellcat was already accelerating again, circling wide as another American destroyer emerged from the opposite flank. For the German crews, the engagement felt unreal. Panthers were accustomed to dictating range and tempo. Now the enemy refused to stay where their guns were pointed. Chaos replaced geometry. Orders overlapped on the radio. Engines roared as drivers attempted to reposition in deep snow. Within minutes, 2 Panthers were burning, their crews scrambling onto the frozen ground under small arms fire. American after-action reports described these first encounters with restrained language, but the subtext was unmistakable. Hellcat units were discovering that raw speed could overwhelm even the most powerful German tanks if the initial strike was clean and decisive. Word spread quickly among German armored formations. Reports described American destroyers that appeared suddenly at extreme speed and attacked from unexpected directions. Some commanders dismissed these early losses as poor positioning or bad luck. Others blamed inexperienced crews. Few immediately grasped what was changing beneath the surface. The battlefield itself was becoming faster than German doctrine had been built to absorb. As January progressed, similar encounters unfolded across the crumbling front. Along forest roads in Luxembourg. Across the rolling fields near the German border. At river crossings where Americans pushed again and again against retreating defenders. Each fight followed a familiar pattern. Panthers attempting to anchor a sector, Hellcats erupting from unexpected vectors, striking weak armor, then vanishing before heavy guns could return effective fire. At close range, the Hellcat's 76mm gun proved brutally efficient. Against side armor, it did not need prolonged engagement. One well-placed round was often enough. Fire spread fast inside cramped German hulls. Ammunition cooked off. Black smoke rose above snowy fields, marking where fortified steel confidence had just failed in seconds. German tank crews began to develop a new fear, not of overwhelming firepower, but of sudden movement. Panther commanders now scanned not only the horizon before them but the distant fields at their flanks, the edges of forests, and the slopes of low ridges where a Hellcat might suddenly appear at full speed. Every unfamiliar engine note raised tension. Every shadow felt like a possible attacker. Inside American units, confidence grew just as quickly. Hellcat crews learned that if they struck first and moved decisively, even the great German tanks could be disoriented and defeated. They refined their timing. Drivers pushed the limits of frozen ground. Commanders took greater risks with wide flanking maneuvers. Gunners trusted that speed would give them the firing angle they needed. But this new confidence carried danger. Hellcats paid dearly when surprise failed. A single well-placed German shot could rip through their thin armor without resistance. When caught in the open or delayed by terrain, Hellcat crews suffered catastrophic losses. Burned-out American destroyers began to dot the same battlefields where Panthers fell. Speed was unforgiving. It rewarded precision and punished hesitation. Both sides were learning rapidly. By mid-January 1945, an invisible escalation had taken hold across the front. German units adjusted with tighter security and overlapping fields of fire. American Hellcat commanders responded with increasingly aggressive reconnaissance and coordinated multi-directional attacks. Each side pushed its doctrine to the breaking point. The early encounters had stripped away illusion. German armor was no longer untouchable. American speed was no longer a novelty. What had begun as scattered shocks was hardening into a new form of armored warfare, one driven not by who possessed the thickest steel, but by who could seize the moment faster than the enemy could react. And soon, in one massive engagement, all of these lessons would converge at once. Because the battlefield was about to become a race measured not in miles, but in seconds, where a few fleeting moments of speed would decide the fate of entire armored formations. Late January 1945. The front along the western edge of Germany had become a lattice of broken roads, shattered villages, and shell-scarred fields glazed with ice. German armored units were no longer maneuvering as cohesive spearheads. They were reacting, moving from crisis to crisis, sealing gaps with whatever fuel and machines remained. For the Americans, the momentum of the advance was carried now by speed itself. And it was here, along a chain of rural roads near the German frontier, that the most violent collision between Hellcats and Panthers unfolded. At dawn, a German Panther company took up defensive positions along a shallow ridgeline overlooking a narrow road network that fed directly into a key supply corridor. The ground was frozen solid. Snow lay thin and crusted across the fields. Visibility was poor beneath low cloud and drifting smoke. The Panthers were dug in nose forward, their frontal armor angled toward the expected American approach. Their commanders believed they were positioned for a textbook defense. They did not know that several miles away, a battalion of M18 Hellcats was already moving at full speed. American reconnaissance had detected the Panther concentration hours earlier. Rather than strike directly, commanders planned a maneuver that relied entirely on the Hellcats' defining asset, mobility. Two companies would draw attention along the main road. A third would race wide across open farmland to strike from the rear. Engines roared to life in the gray winter light. Hellcats surged forward in long, low lines, tracks throwing sheets of ice and mud. Drivers pushed their machines to the limits of control. Commanders stood exposed in their turrets, scanning through binoculars as cold air tore across their faces. The battlefield was quiet ahead. Too quiet. The first contact came as the lead Hellcats crested a shallow rise along the main road. German observers spotted them immediately. Panther turrets began to turn. Guns elevated. Fire commands cut across radio nets. The Germans expected a steady American advance. What they received was a sudden explosion of motion. Hellcats did not halt to trade fire. They accelerated. They fanned outward. Smoke rounds burst across the road to obscure German gunners. Within seconds, American destroyers were darting through gaps in visibility that German turrets could not traverse quickly enough to track. One Panther fired. Its round tore open a Hellcat's thin hull, killing its crew instantly in a violent flash of flame. The burning destroyer skidded across the frozen ground. But the German crews barely had time to register the kill before new threats erupted at their flanks. From behind the ridgeline, the wide-flanking Hellcats arrived at full speed. They appeared almost simultaneously along the rear arc of the Panther formation, machines that German crews believed could not possibly have crossed such open terrain so quickly. The first Hellcat fired into the exposed engine deck of a Panther near the center of the line. The 76mm round punched through, igniting fuel. Flames burst upward. Hatch doors flew open as crew members scrambled into the snow. A second Panther tried to pivot its hull to bring its frontal armor and gun to bear. The maneuver was too slow. Another Hellcat fired from the side. The round struck beneath the turret ring. The turret jammed. Smoke poured from the crew compartment. German radio traffic dissolved into urgency and confusion. Drivers attempted to reverse out of their dug-in positions. Engines strained. Tracks ground against frozen earth. Panthers designed for steady advance now struggled for space as Hellcats swept through their rear arcs like predators. American gunners fired at close range. They did not linger to confirm kills. Each shot was followed by immediate acceleration toward the next angle. Their commanders shouted target shifts over open turrets. Drivers responded with violent turns that hurled the lightweight destroyers across rutted terrain at punishing speed. The battlefield fractured into a series of isolated, desperate duels. Inside the Panthers, the world collapsed into steel, smoke, and heat. Crews fought valves, radios, and sighting mechanisms that had been designed for deliberate warfare. Ammunition loaders worked frantically as shells cooked off nearby. Drivers struggled to reposition under fire they could not fully see. Some Panthers fired blindly into smoke where Hellcats had been seconds earlier. Others simply burned where they stood. American infantry advancing behind the Hellcats watched in stunned disbelief as German armor disintegrated not under waves of heavy tanks, but under fleeting strikes delivered by vehicles that appeared everywhere at once and nowhere long enough to be hit with certainty. Not every American machine survived. German gunners were still skilled. When a Hellcat hesitated too long in an exposed firing position, Panther guns punished the mistake with total finality. Several American destroyers were lost in moments, thin armor shredded by armor-piercing rounds that would have merely scarred a heavier tank. The cost of speed remained absolute. But the momentum of the engagement never shifted back to the Germans. Within the first half hour, the Panther line was broken into fragments. Some tanks attempted to withdraw through narrow farm lanes. Hellcats pursued at distances previously considered reckless for tracked vehicles. They intercepted retreat routes. They fired from angles that German optics struggled to accommodate. Each successful kill compounded the shock already saturating German crews. German command attempted to reorganize the defense from the rear. Orders were given to pull surviving Panthers back toward the next ridgeline. The instructions arrived too late. Fuel shortages and mechanical were trapped several tanks in place. Hellcats closed the distance at full throttle. One Panther, attempting to reverse behind a stone farmhouse, stalled when its track slipped on ice. A Hellcat crested a low berm at speed, fired into the stuck tank's side armor at less than 200 yards, and veered away even as the German vehicle erupted in flame. The engagement lasted less than 15 seconds. By midday, the battlefield was littered with burned German armor. Columns of black smoke rose into the winter sky. American destroyers regrouped briefly on the far side of the ruined Panther position, engines idling as crews reloaded and treated the wounded. German resistance in that sector had collapsed entirely. The final count would be assembled later through field reports and aerial reconnaissance, but the immediate truth was undeniable to everyone present: a German armored defensive line had been shattered primarily by speed. For the first time in the war, German tank crews had not been overmatched by heavier guns or thicker armor. They had been overrun by movement itself. Panthers that once dominated open battlefields with long-range fire now lay scattered and burning, helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on predictable terms. The engagement echoed across the front in whispered reports and emergency briefings. Hellcats were no longer considered curious American destroyers. They were now a known threat, fast enough to dismantle German armor before it could fully react. For the American crews who survived the fight, the lesson was carved into muscle memory and steel: when the Hellcat kept moving, it lived. When it hesitated, it died. And for the Germans who escaped the burning wrecks behind them, another lesson settled in with cold clarity: no amount of armor could compensate for an enemy that seized the battlefield in moments measured by acceleration. What followed was not merely the destruction of tanks, but the unraveling of confidence across Germany's remaining armored forces as the consequences of this new kind of warfare spread far beyond the smoking fields of that single engagement. When the smoke finally thinned over the frozen fields, the full scale of the engagement revealed itself in silent steel. Burned Panthers lay scattered along ridgelines, behind stone farm walls, and half buried in shallow defensive pits that had been meant to stop the American advance. The once cohesive German armored position had been reduced to isolated wrecks and abandoned hulks. A defense built on discipline and geometry had collapsed under a force that refused to stay still. Field intelligence officers moved carefully among the wreckage. Kill confirmations were recorded through gun camera film, crew statements, and aerial reconnaissance conducted later that day. Multiple Panthers had been destroyed in rapid succession, many from rear and side penetrations at close range. The pattern of strikes was unmistakable. These had not been long-range duels. They were fast, surgical kills delivered from angles the German defense structure had never fully anticipated. American losses were also real and visible. Several Hellcats lay burned or shattered along the routes of advance, their thin armor offering no second chances when German fire struck clean. In each wreck, the contrast was sobering: light, fast American machines destroyed as utterly as the heavy tanks they hunted. Speed had given the Americans dominance, but it had demanded blood as payment. The psychological damage inflicted on the German armored arm far exceeded the physical losses. For years, German tank crews had believed, correctly, that their machines gave them control of distance and tempo. Panthers and Tigers were weapons that imposed fear simply by being present. After this engagement and the many similar ones that followed, that confidence cracked. The battlefield had become unpredictable in a way German doctrine struggled to handle. Reports began to emphasize not just American numbers, but American mobility. Commanders warned of rapid flanking destroyers capable of appearing behind established defensive lines within minutes. Morale suffered accordingly. German crews now hesitated before committing to static defenses. Every tree line became suspect. Every stretch of open ground threatened an unseen approach route. Tank commanders began requesting additional infantry screens, slowing already limited movement. Some Panther units withdrew prematurely from positions that would have been held confidently months earlier, fearing attacks from directions they could not secure. At higher levels of command, the engagement reinforced an already grim realization: Germany no longer possessed the operational initiative in armored warfare. The massive consumption of fuel during the Ardennes offensive had left Panzer units chronically undersupplied. Tanks that survived Hellcat attacks often lacked the gasoline to redeploy effectively afterward. Even when German commanders correctly anticipated American movements, they increasingly lacked the logistical means to respond with speed of their own. On the American side, the effects were immediate and far-reaching. Hellcat battalions that had proven their effectiveness in high-speed engagements gained increased operational freedom. Commanders used them more aggressively as mobile shock units rather than purely defensive tank destroyers. Where German armor was suspected, Hellcats were pushed forward as reconnaissance in-force elements, fast enough to trigger reactions, identify weak sectors, and exploit them before German reserves could arrive. American infantry and armored units began adjusting their own expectations as well. Where tank formations once feared isolated encounters with Panthers, they now advanced with growing confidence that Hellcat units could neutralize or disorient German armor before it fully engaged. This shifted the tempo of operations across entire sectors of the front. Advances became bolder. Timetables grew tighter. The enemy no longer dictated the pace. Strategically, the ripple effect extended beyond a single battlefield. By February 1945, German retreat routes toward the Rhine came increasingly under threat from fast-moving American reconnaissance and tank destroyer units. Hellcats were used to probe crossings, chase withdrawing armor, and prevent reorganization at depth. The classic German defensive pattern, strong forward positions followed by organized fallback lines, was repeatedly disrupted by American units that could move faster than the defenders could recalibrate. German field reports from this period speak in the language of erosion rather than collapse. Units were not being annihilated everywhere at once. They were being worn down through constant loss of initiative. Every attempted regrouping was threatened by American speed. Every newly established defense faced infiltration before it could fully harden. Within German tank schools and replacement units, the lessons arrived too late to change the war. Instructors now warned crews to expect fast, lightly armored American destroyers attacking from unpredictable angles. They emphasized coordination with infantry and rear security. But no amount of training could compensate for deteriorating fuel supplies, shrinking manpower, and a front line that was being pushed back mile by mile. By early spring of 1945, the Panzerwaffe no longer fought as the armored juggernaut of earlier years. It fought as a thinning screen, still dangerous, still capable of inflicting losses, but no longer able to restore control through armored counterattack. The Hellcat had not destroyed German armor by itself. But it had helped remove the final illusion that Germany could still dominate the battlefield through steel alone. For the American crewmen who survived those winter battles, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. Speed had carried them through fire and smoke. It had kept them alive when heavier machines would have been trapped. Yet they also knew how easily that same speed could have ended everything with one wrong turn or 1 second of delay. The wrecks behind them were proof not only of victory, but of how narrow the margin between triumph and annihilation had truly been. And as the war rushed toward its final months, the place of the Hellcat in history would soon become clear, not merely as a weapon of speed, but as a symbol of how modern warfare itself had begun to move faster than ever before. By the time the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the battlefields that had once thundered beneath the weight of German armor were scarred by a different truth. The war had not been decided by steel alone. It had been decided by movement, by supply, by the ability to reach the decisive point before the enemy could even react. In that transformation, the M18 Hellcat stood as one of the clearest symbols of what modern warfare had become. The Hellcat never claimed the thick armor or devastating firepower of the great German tanks it hunted. It did not dominate through intimidation or brute force. Instead, it mastered time itself. It arrived where it was not expected. It struck before defenses fully formed. And it vanished before certainty could return. In doing so, it forced the battlefield to accelerate around it. For German tank crews who survived those final winter months, the Hellcat represented more than just another enemy vehicle. It represented the collapse of a worldview. For years, they had trusted in armor, thick plates of steel, precision optics, long guns that ruled open ground. Against speed, however, those advantages could be bypassed, outmaneuvered, and rendered irrelevant in moments too short to counter. For American crews, the Hellcat embodied both victory and vulnerability. They rode exposed to cold, to shrapnel, to sudden death. Every mission demanded nerve and flawless coordination. There was no safety in their machine, only momentum. Many paid the ultimate price when momentum faltered. Yet their willingness to accept that risk allowed entire infantry divisions to move forward, allowed armored breakthroughs to remain unbroken, and denied German forces the ability to regain control once it was lost. In the years that followed the war, armored doctrine across the world absorbed the lesson written in smoke across the fields of Western Germany: speed was no longer a secondary trait. It was a defining principle. Tanks grew faster. Vehicles lighter and more mobile. Commanders learned to think not only in terms of firepower and protection, but of how quickly a force could appear, strike, and reposition. The Hellcat's legacy is not measured in the thickness of its armor or the size of its gun. It is measured in the moments it stole from the enemy, moments that decided battles before they could fully begin. On those frozen roads in 1945, German tank crews learned that the ground beneath their tracks no longer belonged to the heaviest machine on the field. It belonged to the one that moved first, moved fastest, and never stood still long enough to be caught. And in that relentless forward motion, the shape of modern armored warfare was forever changed.